Hola, bona tarda, benvinguts, bienvenidos, welcome. Benvinguts a aquesta xerrada dins del cicle de la Nit Europea de la Recerca. Jo soc Daniel Ramos, treballo pel Centre de Recerca Matemàtica i tenim algunes activitats al canal de YouTube de la Nit de Recerca. Benvinguts, bienvenidos, welcome. Benvinguts a aquesta xerrada dins Disculpeu. I tenim alguns vídeos que podeu veure dins el canal de la recerca i avui tenim el plaer de tenir un convidat que no treballa al Centre de Recerca Matemàtica, però treballa dins un projecte associat, es diu el projecte Cafè. És un projecte del clima per la previsió avançada de fenòmens climàtics subestacionals. És un acrònim una mica complicat, però és un grup que es dedica a la recerca climàtica i estem molt contents de tenir aquí el nostre conferenciant d'avui, Hervé Douville, que ara passaré a presentar. Faré una petita presentació en català i després en anglès pel públic internacional. Hola, Hervé. Hello, bonjour.
Hi, everyone.
Yes. Hervé Douville és investigador del Centre Nacional de Recherches Météorologiques de Météo-France. És a dir, que treballa pel Servei Meteorològic Nacional francès. Fa més de 25 anys que treballa en meteorologia i estudis climàtics. Té més de 150 articles publicats en aquest tema i és especialista en el cicle de l'aigua i forma part d'un grup de recerca que, entre altres coses, estudia la detecció i atribució de canvis climàtics associats a les activitats humanes i estudia i fa projeccions climàtiques pel futur. L'Hervé ha participat en la creació de l'últim informe del Ipcc, que per qui no ho tingui per la mà, l'Ipcc és l'acrònim del Grup Intergovernamental sobre el Canvi Climàtic. És una agència internacional de científics que treballa per encàrrec de les Nacions Unides per preparar informes i altres materials que puguin ser utilitzats per polítics i líders mundials i que tinguin una informació científica acurada i rellevant per prendre decisions. Aquest informe potser l'heu sentit a les notícies perquè aquest últim informe es va publicar el mes passat d'agost i a les notícies va sortir que era com l'advertència més severa dels científics sobre el clima i deia, en molts paràgrafs es retrata un futur molt cru pel clima de la Terra, tret que si no prenem mesures molt severes per reduir les emissions d'efecte hivernacle. Aleshores, Hervé Douville va participar com a autor líder i coordinador a un dels capítols d'aquest informe i ara ens parlarà d'aquesta experiència. So for our international audience, just a quick recap of the presentation of Hervé. He's a researcher at the Centre National de Recherches Météorologiques of Météo-France. So it's the National French Meteorological Service. He has more than 25 years of career in meteorology and climate studies. He has published more than 150 research articles. He's a specialist in the water cycle, and now he's part of a research group that, among other things, he studies the detections and attributions of change in climate associated with human activities. And he makes in this group climate projections for the future. Douville participated in the creation of the last assessment report of the Ipcc, that for those of you who haven't heard about it, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's an international agency of scientists commissioned by the United Nations, which prepares reports and other materials concerning the climate change to provide policy-relevant information to policymakers and world leaders. So maybe you have heard about it in the news. He was called the starkest warning from climate scientists, and it portrays a green future for the Earth's climate unless severe measures are taken by all the countries to cut greenhouse emissions. So Hervé participated on this report as a coordinating lead author, and he's going to talk us about his experience there. So the stage is yours, Hervé. Thank you. You can share your screen.
So I hope you will be
So you can
able. Is it okay? Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. The stage is yours.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Daniel, and thanks to the CAFE project for giving me this opportunity to share some lessons I've drawn from my participation to the latest Ipcc report, so the 6th assessment report, as a participant to the first working group on physical basis of climate change. And to start with, I would like to just comment this humoristic drawing where you see Ipcc projection for snowman in winter 2030, and just with the idea that climate change may not be the main danger to humanity. The main danger may be the humanity reaction to climate change, either by pretending there is no change, like those guys apparently are doing, or either by panicking and maybe leading to the same result. So I have been participating to this IR6 cycle for almost 4 years now. It was a long ride, and I will try to explain why I came to this conclusion, share with you not only some key results of the latest reports, but also some more personal thoughts that I have as a scientist and also maybe as a European and world citizen. So let me first set the scene and remind you that climate policies are made of several dimensions. First of all, manage the inevitable, that is what we call adaptation to climate change, but also avoid the unmanageable, what we call the mitigation of climate change. And in a geopolitical context where big emitters of greenhouse gases also have some thoughts about other possible dimensions like geoengineering, which may consist of, for instance, developing methods like radiation modification to deliberately hide part of the consequences of the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So my talk will be made of 4 parts. First, my view as an insider, as a participant to the Ipcc, my view about this process, some key messages from the report, and addressing the question that was raised in the, for instance, in the public debate about the usefulness and utility and policy relevance of the first working group of Ipcc. I would like also to remind you that the United Nations Secretary has recently called all leaders worldwide to declare a state of climate emergency, which in the French law is not neutral. We are currently in France in emergency state because of the COVID pandemic. And we feel that it should be a transient situation. And the Ipcc has clearly shown that whatever we will do about our emissions during the forthcoming years and decades, unfortunately, we will have to wait for at least 20 years to see concrete results. which doesn't mean at all that we should do nothing, but we should be patient about seeing the results of our climate policies. And so it's an open question to say, should we have a 20-year state of emergency, for instance? So what is the Ipcc mandate? The objective of the Ipcc is to provide governments with scientific information. And for this, for instance, we provide reports, which are also very useful for climate change negotiations, such as the forthcoming COP26 that will be held in Glasgow, in Scotland, in November. The Ipcc authors, they volunteer to assess thousands of scientific papers, and they are among three groups. People like myself in working group 1, trying to have an assessment of the physical drivers of climate change and their manifestation, but also very important working groups on, again, climate adaptation to climate change and mitigation of climate change. And the Ipcc does not conduct its own research, but must be policy relevant and not policy prescriptive. So what is an expert? In France, the concept of expert emerged in the 14th century in the field of justice, and the expert was thought as the eye of the judge, neither his arm nor his brain. And in a broader sense, he became any person empowered on the basis of his technical skills to provide evaluation of or assessments that exclude any subjectivity or personal opinion. Another nice definition at the bottom of this slide is to say that an expert is a kind of mediator between reality and politics, and that it can be defined as an antidote to ignorance. I think it's very important, and we have seen recently with the COVID pandemic that it's really important. So the first working group has different challenges. For him, he needs to be comprehensive, objective, open, and transparent when assessing the available literature about climate change. I was, so as Daniel said, a coordinating lead author of Chapter 8, and for instance, it was not always easy to be open and transparent, because there were some disagreement among us, but we are people, it's really normal. Disagreement about the importance we should give to, for instance, model biases and model uncertainties, because we would like to be transparent about the fact that models are not perfect, but still we are very confident in some key messages that both observation and model provide to us. Another issue is to be comprehensive. These plots are from a paper by Minks et al. And show, so on the left, the increase in the number of publications on climate change. And on the right, you see the proportion of those publications that have been quoted in the different reports, assessment report, about 65% for the first one, down to 25% in the fifth one, and I don't know the number about the sixth one. But what I know is that the sixth report has quoted more than 14,000 publications, which raises the question of have these publications been really assessed? Because we were 234 authors for a huge number of publications. And so it raises also a question about our credibility as scientists to tell people that we should reduce our emissions, because we, as a scientific group, we have not been able to reduce or to think about our production and see how we could be more qualitative and less quantitative. So I guess there are some areas for improvement in the Ipcc report, in the Ipcc process, sorry. Also, it's a very, very, very well-designed process. For sure, we need to be vigilant about discrimination. For instance, as a coordinating author of my chapter, I noticed that we were 3 male coordinating authors and no woman. I think it was a pity. But Ipcc is usually very vigilant about gender discrimination. There is also the language issue. You've seen that I'm not so good in English, and it's an issue for many people in the Ipcc process to be listened to be heard without being very fluent in English. As I said, we should try to evaluate less but better. Maybe so. In terms of science, to be more vigilant about model democracy. It's an issue because we have many, many models, but we don't know which are the best ones. We should be also very careful about what we call internal variability, because we know that just one realization of the 21st century climate by one model does not provide the full picture about what the model should say about climate change. We need several realizations of a single model. And unfortunately, for some application, we've used many, many members for all the models, especially for the detection and attribution of observed climate change over the recent past. But for the projections of future climate, sometimes we've not been able to use many, many members for each model. And for sure, we need to be very careful about the frontiers, the boundaries between evaluation and science production, and also between science and politics. So maybe let's move to the second part of my talk and about the key messages from our latest report. So if it was an in-person conference, I would have asked you who has read this report, at least not the whole report for sure, but the summary for policymakers. And I would have maybe asked a second question, who has spent at least 2 hours watching the Olympic Games this summer? I did both. And when I asked the question to my colleagues recently during a seminar at CNRM, there were more people watching the Olympic Games compared to reading the summary for policymakers. But I can say that it's not only intended for policymakers, it's intended for many, many people, and it doesn't take more than 2 hours to read it. So the report was organized as follows, and it was decided during a scoping meeting before at the beginning of the 6th cycle. So we were not responsible for scoping the outline of the report. And so I was part of chapter 8 on water cycle changes. So there were 12 chapters plus a regional atlas, and 3 chapters are about large-scale climate change. 3 chapters in the atlas are about regional climate information, and we have also chapters more targeted on climate processes. Maybe there is a pity there where the Ipcc sometimes says that the chapter with a red background are more related to WG2 on impacts and adaptation. It's just the opposite. There is a mistake on my slide. So those in red are more related to WG3 on mitigation, and those in green more related to adaptation, and therefore WG2. And in fact, for the water cycle, I would advocate that it's related to both aspects, because the water cycle for sure has some strong link with impacts and vulnerability and adaptation because of floods and droughts, for instance, but it also has strong coupling with the carbon cycle and the energy cycle, and therefore also strong connection with mitigation and therefore the activity of WG3. So what are the key advances of the latest reports? It's a slide that was prepared by the Ipcc Bureau with the CLAs. And so the first advance is an advance in science, where we have made a better use of historic data, improved climate models, and we have developed new ways to combine multiple types of evidence. And for the first time in the Ipcc history, our projections of temperature and sea level rise, temperature change and sea level rise, sorry, are not raw model outputs, but have been constrained by the observed historical warming, for instance. A second key result is about human attribution. A few years ago, more than a decade ago, for instance, where there was this impressive heat wave in France and Europe in 2003, we were not able to tell anything about what is the human contribution to such an event. We have made a lot of progress in this respect, developed new tools, statistical tools to do this. And so we are much more affirmative about the fact that many extreme weather events can be attributed to human-caused climate change. We have looked at 5 categories, 5 families of emission scenarios, and therefore explored a broader range of both greenhouse gases emissions, but also air pollutants emissions compared to the AR5. And we have had a more regional focus with these additional chapters on regional climate change, but also with an interactive atlas that you can all use to look at some results based on global simulation or regional simulation. And many delegations that attended the approval session of this report really appreciated that we have developed this interactive atlas. Just to illustrate this, I show here the use of this atlas comparing the projection of maximum one-day precipitation changes in percent in the long term, that is at the end of the 21st century, comparing CMIP5 models on the left with CMIP6 model on the right, both for the most severe emission scenario. And you see that we can say that the results are quite consistent among the 2 generations of CMIP5 versus CMIP6 models. So some key metrics now, comparing those 2 reports, the AR6 with the former AR5 report that was released in 2013. So if we are looking at the CO2 concentration, at the cumulated emissions, we can see a continued increase, unfortunately. So that clearly there is also an increase in the global surface air temperature. And now, if we assess this global warming in the 2011-2020 decade compared to the early or the late 19th century, sorry. So the current warming is close to 1.1 degrees Celsius, and the sea level rise is close to 20 centimeters. Looking at the future, we have made a strong improvement in the assessment of what we call the equilibrium climate sensitivity, ECS. What is equilibrium climate sensitivity? It's a theoretical metric, but which is very useful because it has a strong relationship with the projection of temperature. It says what will happen for temperature at equilibrium if you double the concentration of atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere. And so you can say that the likely range was between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius at the end of the AR5, in the AR5 report, and against 2.5 to 4 degrees in the new report. So we have halved by 2 the uncertainty, the likely range in this metric, which is a strong progress compared to previous reports. Unfortunately, since we have assessed a wider range of emission scenarios, this has no strong impact on the uncertainty, total uncertainty in the range of temperature, again, global mean temperature or global mean sea level rise that we should face at the end of the 21st century. With still a wide spectrum, a wide range, mostly depending on what we will do during those coming years and decades in terms of mitigation. So strongly depending on the choice of our scenario of emissions. And so a key message of the Ipcc report is that our future belongs to us, at least beyond those 20 years when what will happen is already written. So if we look at the last 170 years, from 1850 to 2020, we can say that the observed warming in black is almost entirely due to the human activities. That is, we have concluded that there is no doubt, it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the climate system. If we look at the decade 2010 to 2019, the observed global warming is 1.06, and the human contribution is 1.07. So it can be entirely explained by human activities, while the natural forcings, for instance, solar activity and volcanic eruption, can only explain between minus or plus 0.1 degree, while internal climate variability only explain between minus or plus 1.2 degrees Celsius. And so there is no alternative to the human influence on the observed global warming. If we look so now at more specific extreme events, and I have selected here two panels, two plots showing a synthesis of the assessment of observed change in heavy precipitation at the top of the slide, and observed change in agricultural and ecological drought at the bottom. You see that there are many regions in green at the top where we have assessed an increase in heavy precipitation, which is very unfortunate since it can, of course, lead to more floods at the global scale. And if we zoom in on the European domain, and we need to be careful about the boundaries of the different regions, because they are shown as idealized region on this diagram, but I've shown on the right a zoom showing that, for instance, the Mediterranean region is quite south and does not include a strong part, for instance, of France, a large part of France, mostly focusing on Spain, Italy, and so on. You see that currently the Ipcc cannot have a strong conclusion about the increase of heavy precipitation in the Mediterranean region. Also, there are some studies showing a strong increase, for instance, in France. But when we assess all the literature that is available on this domain, we can't conclude, like in many other regions, that we already have an increase in heavy precipitation. On the other hand, we clearly see an increase in the frequency and severity of drought, both over Western and Central Europe and the Mediterranean domain. Moving to the future, to our possible future, as I said, they strongly depend on the emission scenarios. And you see at the top panel, so the projection of global mean surface temperature relative to 1850 and 1900. So you see that, of course, if we are able to mitigate our emissions, the warming will be very limited compared to the current temperature we have. But if we are not able, like in the Ssp3 or Ssp5 scenarios, it will be much higher, as strong as 4, for instance, degrees in global mean at the end of the 21st century. And what is also very unfortunate is that there are also some changes that will be irreversible for many decades or even centuries, like sea level rise, for instance. And this is the topic of the bottom panel, where you do see the projection for the global mean sea level change relative to the early 20th century. And so you see that at the end of the 21st century, the sea level rise could be as high as 1 meter in the worst case scenario. But if you look further in the future, for instance, in 2000, at the end, of the 21st century, at the beginning of the 24th century, you see that the increase can be much higher. And for instance, the Ipcc cannot exclude that even in the middle of the next century, the increase could be as high as 5 meters. And over the next 2,000 years, the global mean sea level will rise by about 2 to 3 meters if warming is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there are some long-term changes that are unfortunately irreversible, but that we can limit if we are proactive in mitigating climate change. And of course, there are other changes that we can stop more quickly. For instance, changes in the water cycle. And this is a picture showing some of those changes. And the Ipcc has developed a new framework for analyzing the projection. So not only the SSPs, but also what we call the global warming levels. That is, instead of showing results for different SSPs, for different scenarios, we show results for different levels of global warming. And here, for instance, for annual mean precipitation, percentage changes in annual mean precipitation at the top, or annual mean changes in total soil water column at the bottom, we show such changes for different global warming, 1.5, 2, and 4 degrees. And you do see that with every increment of global warming, changes get larger. Maybe the last slide about the Ipcc report is this very important one about the fact that we reaffirm the near linear relationship that exists between our cumulative CO2 emissions on the x-axis and the increase in global warming on the y-axis. So this is very consistent with what had been shown by the former special report, what we call the SR 1.5 report, special report on climate change limited to 1.5 degree. And this quasi-linear relationship has a strong meaning. It means that there is a climate clock. It means that we can't stop global warming without moving to net zero CO2 emissions. And so it's more subjective to say that there is a climate emergency, of course, but for sure there is a climate clock, and our future will depend on what we are doing now. And maybe we need to think about not only drastic reduction of greenhouse gases emission, but also rapid reduction, rapid, drastic, and sustained reduction if we want to see the result as soon as possible, especially for the forthcoming generation. For instance, if we even look at the intermediate scenario, the Ssp2 scenario, the conclusion of the report is that global warming of 2 degrees Celsius would be extremely likely exceeded during the 21st century. And this specific scenario is currently maybe the closest to the current trend in our emissions. And the United Nations Secretary, Antonio Guterres, has said 1 week ago that unless wealthy nations commit to tackling emissions now, the world is on a catastrophic pathway to a 2.7 degrees warming at the end of the century. So we are currently in a phase where we need to do more about mitigating climate change if we want to avoid more than 2 degree global warming. So it's a long time we've been seeing this, and the climate action is there, but maybe is still not enough. And so some people ask, does the Ipcc, and especially the first working group, is really useful and policy relevant? And for instance, there is a scientist rebellion group that said, what is the point in documenting in ever greater detail the catastrophe we face if we are not willing to do anything about it? So I think the question is relevant, but I still think, of course, that the Ipcc working group 1 is still very useful, and I will try to explain why. The question is relevant, yes. If you look at Google Trends, for instance, and here I'm just focusing on France, but if you do the same for the whole world, you more or less get the same results. You see over the recent period, starting in January 2020, that the interest on the internet on the Ipcc or on climate change, it would have been the same in red, was very, very low. And there is a small peak that you need to zoom in to see it just during the publication of the latest report. Of course, it's partly due to the fact that the COVID has attracted a lot of attention over recent years. But you can see as well that football, that is quite popular in France, in Spain, and in many European countries, has attracted also much more attention compared to climate change. It's a reality. Yet, climate models are still improving, and this is also one of the drawing from the latest Ipcc report, comparing 3 successive generations of climate model, what we call Ssp3, Ssp5, and the most recent Ssp6 generation of climate models, of global climate models that are a strong basis for the Ipcc assessment. And you see, for instance, if you zoom in on the progress in precipitation simulation for present-day climate, that the patterns of those global precipitation fields for the present-day climatology are much better correlated with observation compared to the previous generation models. So we are still improving the models. Yet projections are still very uncertain, more for precipitation than for temperature. And here my illustration, and it's a bit complicated figure I will try to explain, is about annual mean precipitation change. And there are 3 periods. At the top, the near-term changes. In the middle, the mid-term changes. What we call the mid-term changes is between 2041 and 2060. And at the bottom, the long-term changes. And the total uncertainty in the projection, the fractional uncertainty, the percentage of uncertainty, is divided into 3 contributions. The effect of internal variability, the intrinsic variability of the climate system, the effect of model uncertainty, and the effect of scenario uncertainty. That is the choice among the different SSPs. And you see, for instance, if we focus on the middle row, that this scenario uncertainty, globally average, is just 6% of the total uncertainty, which does not mean at all, that we should not mitigate climate change and try to reduce our greenhouse gases emissions, but which means that still most of the uncertainty is due to to weaknesses in the models and to what we call the model response uncertainty, which represents 77% of the uncertainty in the mid-range, and which is still the main source of uncertainty, and so deserve further work in the first working group of Ipcc. Another good reason to carry on our activities is to realize that all the SSPs that are compatible with global warming less than 2 degrees Celsius, they assume that we will be able to implement what we call land-based carbon dioxide removal techniques. And that there is still a strong scientific debate about the potential of these techniques. For instance, there was a recent paper in Science that assessed that there was a strong potential for capturing carbon and putting it in vegetation if we grow forest. So reforestation and afforestation could be a very important solution to climate change. But this science paper has raised many comments, including the one by Pierre Friedlichstein, stating that the claims that global tree restoration is our most effective climate change solution is simply incorrect scientifically and dangerously misleading. So again, we need more work on such possibility and on this research topic. And the Ipcc concludes that land and ocean-based carbon dioxide removal methods have the potential to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, for sure, but the benefits of this removal would be partially offset by CO2 release from land and ocean carbon stores. And we state this with very high confidence. And we also say that the deployment of these techniques, particularly on land, can also affect water quality and quantity, food production, and biodiversity. So again, it raises a lot of questions. And for instance, this is what I would like to illustrate on the right of my slide, the fact that usually working group 3 on mitigation is on the top of the chain, moving from WG3 to WG2 through WG1. But we've been observing over recent years that, for instance, we have observed many wildfires. And WG1 and WG2 assess that the frequency and the severity of those wildfires is currently increasing. Does WG3 really account of this when he assesses the potential of reforestation and afforestation, for instance? Because it's good if we can reforest or afforest, but what if those forests burn in wildfires? So, for concluding about the utility, the usefulness, of WG1, I will say that for sure WG1 is policy relevant and is still useful, but modeling progress is slow compared to the speed of observed changes. And so we will need to develop new techniques merging observations and models to increase the observational constraint on our projection. And this is what we have been able to do in the IR6, just for temperature and sea level rise. And we need to do this also, for instance, for the water cycle changes. We need also more coordination with the other working groups. And maybe we need to think of publishing the conclusion of our first working group without presenting, in parallel to presenting, the solution about mitigation and adaptation. This is at least the point of view that has been recently developed by Mike Hulme, who says it is time for the Ipcc to put the cart, that is science, after the horse, that is energy and adaptation policies. And we can realize that we will have this COP26 in November only with the latest Ipcc results about WG1, since WG2 and WG3 reports, unfortunately, will be released in early 2022. So what is my conclusion? My conclusion is, do we have our backs against the wall, and what role can climate scientists play in this context? So I would say that it all depends on the perspective. From the WG1 perspective on the left, we are not in front of the wall. We are climbing the wall. We are within the wall. This is so the reconstruction of global mean temperature over the last 2 millennia. And you see that we are in the wall. And in fact, if we can hope that, for instance, the intermediate scenario is the one that we will follow for the forthcoming decades, we are maybe at a time where the rate of climate change, of global warming, is the highest that we will ever face. And this is also why we do see a strong increase in the number of climate records that are broken over recent years, because as nicely shown by a recent paper by Erich Fischer from ETH, the probability of occurrence of those extremes depends on the warming rate, as much or even more than on global warming level. But from a WG3 perspective, we are not within the wall, we are in front of the wall. It's like we were skiing on a black run. I'm not a good skier, but when I do such a slope, to be able to move to zero net emission, for instance, by 2050, I do not feel very comfortable. It also depends on the perspective when we compare the WG1 with the WG2 perspective. From the WG2 perspective, disaster risk depend on 3 dimensions. Not only the weather and climate events by themselves, which is assessed by WG1, but also for sure the exposure and the vulnerability of the populations. And for instance, I show those results from a recent publication that was not assessed by the IR6 because it was published later on, that compares decade by decade the exposure, the population, the global population exposure to precipitation extremes in the future over global land. So we see first that in gray, there are already for sure many people exposed to such events. And sometimes we were not very aware of this or not very careful about them. But unfortunately, we see that the number of people that will be exposed will increase in all Ssp scenarios that we have explored. But interestingly, the strongest exposure does not appear in what the WG1 generally consider as the worst case scenario, that is the Ssp5. It appears in the Ssp3 emission scenario for a simple reason. This Ssp3 scenario has less emissions, but also has less equity among populations, less education in developing countries, and so much more people at the end of the 21st century. And so what explains the difference is mostly the demography. And the demography is also an issue if you want to consider the number of people that will be exposed to the severe, the most extreme consequences of climate change. So, three more slides. Is it worse or effective, even effective, to add fear to anxiety? For instance, Professor Schellhuber said a few time ago that there is a very big risk that we will just end our civilization. You know, we will have to change our civilization, but never the Ipcc states that it's the end of our civilization. Also, we could note that WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, recently has released a report saying that the number of disasters has increased by a factor of 5 over the recent 50-year period, not only driven by climate change, mostly driven by climate change, but also because of an improved reporting about these disasters. And interestingly, they also state that thanks to improved early warnings and disaster management, the number of deaths has decreased by a factor of 3. Again, we are in the face of a very important threat. Climate change is a very important threat, but we should not panic. Because if we look, for instance, as a Lancet publication, we can see that a pool survey among 10,000 young people in Europe, including around the world, not only Europe, including in France, says that 75% of those young people consider the future to be frightening, and that 56 think that humanity is doomed. And if you listen to for instance, sociologists, and for instance, to Marie de Rubella, a French sociologist, they say that overall, playing on fear can effectively motivate attitudes unless it is too great. If it's too great, people seek above all to control the anxiety they feel, and for instance, by minimizing the threats through defensive processes of the information. And another very interesting publication in the Lancet review has drawn 3 lessons from the recent lack of adhesion to COVID vaccination and try to apply those lessons to the transition to climate change, to net zero carbon emissions and to the climate policies. The first lesson is that the public must not be forgotten during the transition. The second one is that we need to identify and support trusted messengers. And the third one is that we need to humanize the data. The Ipcc reports are plenty of data and figures, but we need also to take care of our narratives And it's very difficult because if we move to narratives, we need still to be very rigorous and to be not too much subjective. So my last slide about the function and role of climate scientists is that we are mediators. We are mediators, but between politicians and reality, for instance, but we also need mediators. We need mediators between science and policy and between science and the public opinion. And those mediators, for instance, are journalists, but are also social medias. And for instance, what we are doing now is a kind of mediation between science and policy and science and public opinion. And again, I would like to emphasize that the concept of climate risk is evolving because we had first 3 dimensions: hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. But as I said in my introduction, there is a new dimension. It's human response itself. A clear example is that, for instance, it's about air conditioning. If we all use air conditioning to fight about hot events, it may be good for adaptation, but not good for mitigation. But that there are much more maybe subtle examples where we can see that if we panic, if we are not rational in our responses, we will get into trouble. And so, as a climate scientist, I'm still addressing this question to my colleagues. Where should we be in this wide spectrum between those scientists that call for a climate revolution and other one, like a former Météo-France head that suggested that the role of the natural science is not to say what to do or how to do it or whether it can be done, but to say, just to say, with as little uncertainty as possible, what will happen if we do this or that. And it will be my conclusion. Thanks for your attention.
So thank you, Hervé. Merci. It's very, very interesting. Thank you for this brief introduction or summary to this report that probably most of us, we haven't spent the 2 hours on reading. But it's good to have these overviews, and I would like to invite everybody to put some questions in the chat in the YouTube if for our viewers. But meanwhile, and since we have a short delay of about 30 seconds between the broadcast and the YouTube, I would like to start by asking you something about this report, or what do you think that people, not only policymakers, but people in general could take home? So is there any misconception or thing that you think that people get wrong, or that you think that people should know about? That if there is some a small build-up from all this report that say, oh, if you could just have to look to this small thing that it's explained there, that people don't get, or something like that.
Which piece would be the most important for the people to read? Maybe a quite technical piece, but still very policy relevant. The fact that again, our future belongs to us. Not the near-term future, unfortunately, but the mid to long-term future really belongs to us. But because now it's very clear that if we stop our emissions, we stop global warming. And it was not so clear. I've talked about the irreversible changes, for instance, sea level rise, or even ice sheet melting. It will take a long time. But global mean temperature will react quite quickly. Why? Because despite the fact that the radiative equilibrium at the top of the atmosphere will not be completed as soon as we will be moving to net zero CO2 emissions, yet there will be some carbon cycle feedbacks that will help us to stabilize the temperature. So we can be effective. We can be effective if we want to be effective.
Mm-hmm. So we are not completely doomed, right? Just for a few years,
yeah,
but in the
sure.
future we still can do
For sure,
things.
we are not. And as I said also, we can develop adaptation strategies to face the inevitable climate change that will occur over those forthcoming decades. But as I said as well, in fact, it won't be much worse than what we are currently experiencing because the rate of climate change is very high currently.
Mm-hmm. And the question more in the, I don't know if your personal level or something, have you ever met face-to-face a politician or someone who has some capacity for taking some far-reaching decisions, and you have explained your research or this or this report and what was his or her attitude?
I will do this soon. Some of my colleagues, some of my French Ipcc colleagues have already made a presentation in front of the French Parliament. I will go to the Senate, I don't know if it's the right word in English, in early October. And I will try to participate also to the COP26 in November. But to be honest, I had only a few opportunities currently to discuss with politicians. I think that there is a wide spectrum about their knowledge of climate change. Some are very well informed, some are not. Just like everyone, you know. And so we still need to meet them, to explain them, and to tell them how urgent it is to do something about it. That is what I will try to do with my colleagues.
I think it's important also for the all public, the general public opinion to be aware. So the politicians are at the end are elected from us, and they are reflect of society. So good luck trying to with them. So I have now some questions that come from the chat. Thank you for the talk. It was a very interesting topic. My question is, from your point of view, where should we start to tackle in a more efficient way the issue of climate change? So what would be the most efficient action?
So again, there are multiple dimensions at different levels. Of course, the international negotiations are very important. We know that we as Europeans, we are not the main contributors to greenhouse gases emissions, even if we do emit a lot since a long time now, and still too much. And beyond this, so international level, at our personal level also, we can do a lot. There was a study in France suggesting that we need to reduce by 80% our emissions, in France, if we want to avoid a global warming above 1.5 degrees, 80%. And it was shown by young engineers that currently our citizen contribution, doing efforts about our way to move, to travel, to eat, our use of energy, everything that can be done in our daily lives, it could help to contribute to 20% of this effort. But in fact, 20% only because of a lack of motivation, because only a limited fraction of the population is motivated to do this. If everyone was motivated, it could represent, according to this study, 45% of the needed effort. So we can't just blame our government, I would say. They are very important. They need to decide laws that will help us to do this. But for sure, we have also an individual responsibility in this process, not only during the polls, but just as individuals during everyday life, I would say.
Just a follow-up from my side, it's do you think that changes in technology would be efficient for this changing, or we need to rethink society and it's a problem of surpopulation of the earth and we should really change the model of ever growing? Or can the technology of changing to electric cars and solar panels be enough?
So as a WG1 person, I'm not, it's not my expertise. So I will answer this question, but as a citizen, and as a citizen, I doubt that we cannot change our model. We can avoid changing our model. I think we need to change our model. And that technology, innovation is not the only solution to the problem. And it's a kind of runaway where we still expect that technology will be able to help us to solve the solutions that partly technology is responsible for. But we need to be honest. I'm interested in low tech, for instance, and in sobriety and things like that. But we need also to recognize that technology can be very helpful. For instance, without high tech and a lot of money, would it been able to have those vaccines very efficient for the pandemic? So we need to really think carefully about this and to try to find the middle where we do the best use of technology, avoiding the issues with technology, and thinking also of more sobriety in our behavior so that we can have a nice planet for the next generation as well. This is my feeling.
Good. I have a question here from a colleague scientist that says, which would you say is the main challenge for us as scientists on how to properly communicate the research and this report to the general public?
Yeah, that's an excellent question as well. And so this is something that Ipcc authors are thinking about, of course. And we are more convinced that numbers and plots are not enough. We need narratives again. Narratives. So sometimes climate literacy is not just made by scientists. We could think of novels, of many ways sorry, I'm limited in my English to tell about this, but to reach the spirits of people. And we as scientists, we also need to think of how to use such narratives. Again, being very careful, not panicking people, being as strict, rigorous as possible, but still humanizing the data and trying to make it clear that it's not just numbers. And for instance, one way to do this is to have a focus, for instance, on specific events, on extreme events, for instance, rather than just talking about global warming. Looking at the internet, I was so disappointed about the lack of interest on the internet on climate change. But for instance, there is a huge interest on weather forecasts. So we as meteorologists, we could use those daily forecasts to remind people that if the weather is hotter than usual, we can't say that it's a good point when it's winter and that we see people, for instance, having a bath in the sea, but it's a bad point in summer when we have a hot spell, because it's the same reason behind. So we need not to be schizophrenic and remind people that for sure there are some advantages about global warming, but there are more danger than advantages.
Yeah, I have seen people going to the beach in November and saying, "Oh, climate change is fantastic."
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, let me see if we have. We have another question. I have understood that 14,000 references are too many for 200 authors. Which would be the necessary number of authors or references?
Again, a very good question. I think it would not be a good idea to have more authors, because, you know, it's not a pleasure to be author. It's a very interesting experience, but it's a lot of work. And so it's good that it's only for 200 or 234 people. So I think we need to think about what will be the criteria for selecting papers that we will assess. And maybe as researchers, what can I do? What can I do that can be interesting, not just for my career, but for the general interest? Is it really necessary to do this publication? What does it add to the knowledge? And for instance, don't we think that there is a kind of now industry about science publications, with publications that maybe still have some contributors, but not many readers, sorry. So there are many questions that we can address, and we as scientists, we have a responsibility in this, and I think we should think of doing better science without producing more papers. But it's a tricky issue, because as a scientist, we are evaluated mostly based on our number of publications. So it raises a question about it also raises a question about how we should evaluate scientific activity. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that maybe the next report will use machine learning or artificial intelligence.
It was a kind of provocation, but that's sure that at least what I'm sure is that we have not been able to read all those papers that we quote. We have read usually the abstract. When we were really interested, we read more, but there are many circumstances when we did not really assess the whole paper.
Mm-hmm. I have one more question here. Yeah, maybe related with what you say, that you will participate in the Senate and for the assessment for the French government. The question is, have you noticed a change in the way the policymakers approach the scientists? Are they, in your opinion, more willing to listen and understand the information that research provides?
I'm not sure we can have a general response to this. It really depends on the audience. But there are more and more interest in climate change. In France, as in many other European countries, I guess, I don't know about Spain, you have now some public action against the government. We go to the court, for instance, where people ask to punish the governments because of climate inaction. So there is a new dimension in climate policies, is that the fact that people can go to the court, and this is why, for instance, we currently are developing a climate dictionary here in France for justice, for judges, so that they can understand more about climate change, because we feel that they will be more and more involved in this process. I think politicians are more and more aware about this problem and have no choice. They will have to do something about it.
It's very interesting that there's all this climate interferes in social justice and in the society and in politics. We cannot avoid it. It's not something outside. It permeates everything. So I think we have more or less answered the questions that we have now in the chat. And I think it's a good time to stop the talk.
Thanks a lot again, Daniel, for the invitation and for the interesting questions.
Thank you for your interesting talk and your insights on the report, and for your research and all the other authors and scientists that are trying to provide better information of what is happening in our world. So,
okay.
Thank you also to all the spectators. Gràcies a tots per la vostra atenció, and see you in the next talk sometime.
Bye, everyone.